Well, welcome everyone. My name is Stephen Norris, and I am the Walter Havinghurst Professor of History and the Director of the Havinghurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies at Miami University in Ohio. And it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Vladislav Zubok, who has been to the center before and given talks, and is also a professor now of international history at the London School of Economics. An internationally recognized expert on the Cold War and on the history of foreign relations, Professor Zubok is the author or co-author of 8 books in English and 3 more in Russian, including The Idea of Russia, The Life and Work of Dmitry Likhachov, which has been out in both English and Russian, A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union in the Cold War, from Stalin to Gorbachev, and Zhivago's Children, The Last Russian Intelligentsia. Professor Zubok was born and educated in Moscow, where he's joining us now, and he studied for his undergraduate degree at Moscow State University and his PhD at the Institute for the US and Canada in Moscow. Before moving to the London School of Economics, he was a fellow at the National Security Archive and then a professor of history at Temple University in Philadelphia. He was also, I should admit here, a visiting professor at the University of Virginia when I was a graduate student, and I had him in a graduate seminar on the Cold War about 25 years ago, right now, when I first met Vlad. Yes. His latest book and the subject of our conversation today is called Collapse, the End of the Soviet Union, and it will be published later this year with Yale University Press. So welcome, Vlad. Good to see you again. And let me start.
Good to see you.
Great. Let me start by asking about your own memories. Where were you in August 1991, and what do you recall from the dramatic days of that month?
Oh my, yes, I was on a plane flying to New York from Moscow, and we stopped for refueling in Ireland. So after a couple of Guinnesses, I returned to my plane in an excellent mood. And all of a sudden, when the plane took off, I overheard the conversation of the couple of people in front of me that this windbag should have been removed long ago. And they were talking about Gorbachev. And I thought, strange that they may have misinterpreted the news. I mean, it's totally impossible. But then, of course, I arrived to New York City and picked the New York Times, already there, fresh with the screaming headlines. So I had two conflicting ideas of boarding another plane and returning, but fortunately did not do it because I had my wife and a child waiting for me in Amherst at the time. So I missed probably the most glorious moment for Russian democracy, and watched everything on CNN. And my friends were talking on ABC and other news, and I was deeply, deeply envious. I thought I was missing really, the most important moment in the history of Russia. But in a way to compensate it, 30 years later, I produced the book. So this is how it happened.
That's a great segue. Interesting that you and I watched the August coup the same way. I was about to be a sophomore in college, and I too watched everything unfold on CNN. I didn't know that. But speaking of the book, you've written 2 books that tackle the Soviet collapse, albeit not as their focus: Inside the Kremlin's Cold War, your first book, and Failed Empire. So how has Collapse, the book you're about to publish, evolved from these previous works? And what are the major conclusions in Collapse that differ from or build on those previous books?
Well, Steve, I was in Amherst to contemplate my first project, which ultimately would become Inside the Kremlin's Cold War, co-written with Kostya Pleshikov. And I don't even remember what we wrote about the Soviet collapse in that first book, published in 1996. But if there's something on the Soviet collapse that was completely lyrical afterthought, so to say. It was exciting time, new opportunities. Both of us were in the West discovering the new world and new opportunities. So all our thoughts were about the future. And the first project was the Cold War, which is, way, way past, from Stalin to Khrushchev. That's how it was. So I remember, however, very clearly when I boarded the plane and landed in Moscow, on December 31st, 1991. And I discovered to my amazement that we had to get out of the plane and walk in really sub-zero temperatures with all our luggage across this huge, dark, icy field. And there were no custom officers. There were no, if I remember correctly, nobody even checked our passports. Sheremetyevo, our airport, was totally empty and dead, as if the state disappeared. So that was for me kind of, it's something wrong. Something is wrong here. And of course, in 2 days, the Gaidar reform, the shock, so-called famous or infamous shock therapy started. So that was the contest. When I wrote the first book, I was thinking really, I was trying to escape what happened in Russia and, and stay a historian, because most of my friends had to do different kind of things. They went into business, they went into politics and all kinds of other things to survive. The second book, written by myself, called The Failed Empire, already has, I think, has 2 chapters. In the last chapter where I reflect on Gorbachev's personality. And I think I stick with many conclusions from this chapter in The Failed Empire. But in my new book, Collapse, I do not decenter Gorbachev, but I add a lot. I add a lot what was not included and could not be included in the last 2 chapters of The Failed Empire. I add of course, many new characters, new actors. I speak a lot about the way Collapse proceeded. The book has 15 chapters. It's 560 pages. So I start roughly in 1983, but very, very quickly get to 1986, 88, that is the perestroika reforms. And the further I go, the more dense the forest becomes, so to say, the more detailed the book gets. And at the end of it, the editors forced me to cut it by 1/3, which is probably the fate of many projects of this kind, because I simply didn't know when to stop. The main, it's the main conclusions and which way they differ from the Failed Empire. To begin with, The Failed Empire is about the Soviet Union and the Cold War. It's not about the disappearance of the Soviet state or the self-annihilation of the Soviet state. At that time, I felt I wasn't equipped to deal with this monumental task. So when I get to this project, Collapse, I confronted many, many obstacles. For instance, how to understand what happened in economy. And I think I solved it, not by myself, with the help of some excellent experts and friends. I dealt with what happened to the military-industrial complex, what happened to the party and other main bureaucratic structures of the Soviet Union. And when I reached the coup, this moment in August 1991, I kind of made this good Orthodox cross and said, thanks goodness, I probably reached the moment when the Soviet Union is over. And many people declared it was over after August 1991. And yet I had to write 4 more chapters. And to my surprise, I discovered how resilient the Soviet Union was, almost to the very end. But that's the story I tell. So when people pick the book, finally, they will judge if I did the good job. I believe I did a good job on this.
Well, I can't wait to see and judge for myself. But back to The Failed Empire and the way you characterize Gorbachev in it, and again to ask a little further about Collapse. In Failed Empire, you write that you criticize Gorbachev as proof of the opposite of the perennial human illusion to attribute great events to great causes, and say he's someone who had a great mind but a weak character. and that he was key to the collapse at that time, at least in terms of the Cold War and the collapse of this failed empire. He, as you write, he took ideas too seriously, was self-confident and optimistic when he shouldn't have been, was naive at times, and engaged in what you call ad hocism. So is that still true, or is Gorbachev ultimately the major cause of the collapse here? And related to that, how has your thinking and evaluation of Gorbachev evolved since you wrote Failed Empire?
Oh, that's a big question, good question. The way to approach it, I guess I should say that, you know, I try to stay away from the analysis of structures, because most of the analyses of the Soviet collapse began after the Soviet Union collapsed. And everybody who just in 1988 said, oh, it's inconceivable, oh, it's impossible, after 1991, looking at the structures. So, but of course, it was inevitable. It was overdetermined. So, you know, for me, it's an easy way out of this puzzle, as I call it in my preface. So instead of focusing on structures, which of course I study, and of course I write about structural causes of Soviet malaise and if you like, economic deadlock in a sense, and political deadlock, I switched to functionality and then functional dynamical factors and of course personalities. And for me, yes, Gorbachev stays an absolutely fascinating personality, the person who admired Lenin, who emulated Lenin, who read Lenin regularly in search of a clue for practical policies, even in 1989. And yet, as we all know, rejected the basics of Leninism and Lenin's wielding methods of power, such as terror and the use of the party, the use of the state. Gorbachev abhorred violence, abhorred using administrative elements of power, I should say. To make long story short, this is the person who developed an uncanny, at least for Russian history and Soviet history, the uncanny propensity to devolve and delegate power. And if you look at the story of Perestroika from 1986 or 85, of course, he became general secretary, when all forms of absolute power just came to him. He didn't fight for it. He didn't, he didn't have, well, he had some other, contenders, of course. People write about Romanov, people write about all other forgotten personalities of the time. But essentially, Comrade Gromyko said, we have Comrade Gorbachev. Let's have him as our next leader. We know that Yuri Andropov wanted Gorbachev to be the next Soviet leader, and so on and so forth. And yet, he in the next 5 years either devolved this enormous power to others, or willingly or unwillingly undercut most important forms of that power, beginning with the party, of course, the political. The backbone of the political power in the Soviet Union, then economic power, financial power, and ended up with the forms of and tools of power that he actually didn't like. It didn't want to use. That is the KGB, the army, the police, and ended up soon after the coup in the position of King Lear, that famously gave away all the liens and fiefdoms and was left with nothing to lament ingratitude of feudal lords and his daughters. That's a remarkable story, but and I tell about this in my book, but I put it in context, because unlike in a Failed Empire, where I sort of write about the fateful personality of Gorbachev, here I try to understand, how this personality came about. And fortunately, I did my own research and read a lot about the last Russian intelligentsia. I sort of know very well what was the generational experience that, let's say, not totally explained Gorbachev, but again, explains why such a person as Gorbachev was made possible at that unique time in history, how it became possible. But as I said, I pay attention to the elites of all kinds, to bureaucracies, and I privilege economy and financial disarray. Sort of my focus is on why Gorbachev let it all happen, and why the elites or elements of the elites that saw this happening, saw the seniors of power being consciously or unconsciously undermined by Gorbachev's perestroika, why they couldn't stop him. And when they tried, it was too late.
So one of the questions that has consistently been asked since the collapse, and I'm thinking particularly about 10 years ago or so, there was a special issue of the Slavic Review about this, was whether or not, given what you just said, whether or not the reforms under Gorbachev could have been sharper, better, less drastic. In other words, whether or not the Soviet Union could have survived had Gorbachev done things differently. And I guess I'm curious your answer to that. And then, of course, the question that begs is whether it would have mattered or whether we should care about it. But whether the Soviet Union could have reformed differently, maybe even in the economic sense that you focus on.
Well, there are two currents, Steve, that I sort of had when I was trying to write the book. I felt if I went in the wrong direction, the material, the sources resisted. I said, oh, maybe my analysis goes in the wrong direction. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Let me recalibrate my research and my analysis. Of course, the Soviet Union could have been reformed in a different way. So, for instance, why Gorbachev tried to combine in a very hasty manner the construction of so-called economic social democracy when he devolved huge economic power to state enterprises, cooperatives, and republics as a major economic decentralization that he and his government undertook in 1987-88. In a very hasty manner. He combined it with political liberalization. And some scholars say, oh, because he didn't see good results and he wanted to remove that bureaucracy that resisted the reforms. When you look into bureaucracy, you discover something really weird. The bureaucracy wanted reforms. The bureaucracy was utterly confused by what Gorbachev was trying to do. Bureaucracy did not understand why he was doing it and didn't believe that this would lead to any positive results for economy, for the country, and of course for themselves, the bureaucrats. And moreover, I can tell you, most of the people also didn't see it that way. Gorbachev's popularity began to plummet, not only as a result of his misguided anti-alcohol campaign, that we know very well, but particularly in 1988, when he and his government of Nikolai Ryzhkov introduced a major economic decentralization reform, and cooperatives appeared, and a huge number of people opposed that reform not because they were reactionary, retrograde Soviets and so on and so forth. Perhaps they were, but also because they could clearly see in their daily life that those reforms brought deterioration, not improvement of economic performance. And there are millions of signals to Gorbachev, and Gorbachev refused to accept those signals. He basically said, oh, people don't know what they're talking about. But at the same time, Gorbachev gave to people enormous opportunity to say what they want and say what they feel. He created those unwieldy, monstrous representative institutions of people's congresses, the People's Congress of the Soviet Union, Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, and then moved to the next stage, created the same huge representative structures in each republic, and most faithfully, of course, in the Russian Federation. in the Russian Federation. So, why he did all that? Was it necessary to do those reforms? Of course not. Of course not. There was one way of reforming that was particularly dear to Gorbachev and a number of experts around him. Was it determined somehow by the previous attempts of reforms? Yes, it didn't fall from the sky. The roots of this erroneous and disastrous approach to reforms can be found in the 1960s, including the Kosygin reform, although I should say the Kosygin reform was much better thought through and better implemented than Gorbachevian reforms. And ultimately, look at the way people in the Politburo led by Gorbachev delegated power to the republics. Did they know about the danger of Russian separatism? Yes, they talked about it. We have plenty of records. Did they know that without the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union would not exist? Yes, they knew, and still they rushed ahead as if, a captain of Titanic that sees the iceberg, and instead of at least trying to turn around this iceberg, says, full speed ahead, we'll just ram through this iceberg and go further. That was a remarkable story, really. And, when I wrote about it, at many points, I kind of scratched the back of my head and telling myself, isn't history sometimes not rational process? Is there an element of irrationality in all this, or something I don't understand even 30 years later?
So I'm curious because you've mentioned not just about irrationality here, but you've mentioned people in general, bureaucracies, other government officials, and the way they helped fuel the events of 1991. And it reminds me of Svetlana Alexeyevich's book, Secondhand Time, which captures a lot of these sentiments, including in a chapter called How We Fell In and Out of Love with Gorbachev. And she says she chronicles the chronicle of feelings from that time. So I'm curious, how do you, if at all, try to capture the many disparate 1991s, these irrational or sometimes rational, sometimes irrational experiences and thoughts that made that year significant, and then help explain the way that year was first experienced and then remembered?
Well, that's why I wrote the book, Steve, because I could discover in this story myself 30 years ago that much younger Zubok, who marched in the streets, rooted for perestroika first and chanted all power to the Soviets, then got disillusioned with Gorbachev and tried to root for Yeltsin. And I had to struggle with this younger Zubok in my book, because the evidence that, at that time I thought, oh, the military dictatorship was coming and the military could be, could build a fascist, regime in our country. So my main enemy was, as they used to say during the first Russian Revolution, on the right, bureaucracies, the military, the KGB, all those predictable suspects. And nothing inside me told me that the collapse of the state might produce lots and lots of problems, not to mention loss of control of the army, loss of control over nuclear weapons. So it was only after the effect. This is why I mentioned my own reminiscences of December 31st, 1991. Oops, I don't see the state. What happened to the state? The state disappeared. In what way? How now we Democrats, we liberals will implement reforms in the country without the state? Let me tell you, I was never an anarchist. I never believed in anarchy, the mother of order. So, my own memories, of course, a lot of interesting things I remembered. I was already 30 years old. I was at the Institute of USA in Canada. I thought I'm at the pinnacle of, educated elites and that I understood everything. Of course, I was wrong. And what I noticed that was exhilarating times, unprecedented changes, a sort of a revolution, but it was a strange revolution. I remember very, very clearly, because I thought, why there are no more younger people involved? most of the people, beginning with Gorbachev, Yakovlev, Shevardnadze, and all of them, were people older than 50 and then sometimes 60. And Yeltsin and Gorbachev were born in 1931, same year, 1 month apart. So what happened to my generation? What happened to the generation in between? So when I worked on the book, I discovered it actually mattered, because when Yeltsin created a counter elite, a few miles from the Kremlin in the so-called Russian White House, the building of the Russian parliament, he created this elite trying to attract different people, younger people, but also provincial bureaucracies, people who were not part of the westernized Gorbachevian elites in the old square in the Kremlin. And that was interesting. But the consequences of this, I could analyze only later, I should say, quarter of a century later. I do remember the fall of 1990, when I wrote a chapter about this fall. We all feared a dictatorship. We all rumored about the movements of the troops around Moscow. And as I wrote this chapter, I kind of struggled with my rumors. David Remnick, in his book, excellent, I think, account of the times, Lenin's tomb, wrote about Black September. So I delved into this and I found very little that corroborated those rumors. So, then I sort of compared it to the events of the French Revolution, where rumors, of course, meant, everything, and created that enormous revolutionary agitation, both in the Parisian suburbs and in the provinces. So, it was helpful to go back to different histories, go back to one's own memories, and so on and so forth. And finally, the memories of the coup. Because I stayed away, I guess I didn't have that curious phenomenon when the same people who went to the White House, Russian White House, to defend it for 2 nights, for 2 crucial nights of the August coup, had huge disillusionment later on. So that kind of volte-face of, enormous exhilaration, fear, of course, exhilaration, hope, and then disillusionment in the next several months, I didn't have. And that, when I try to share my analysis, that I'm speaking about recent discussions, when we sort of commemorated 30 years of the August coup, I discovered to my surprise how few people in Russia are prepared to listen to so-called balanced analysis of the coup. They are parti pris, they're already taken sides decades ago. It's very difficult to tell them the comprehensive story, even today. So memories can help, memories can hurt. Memories can prevent you from writing a more nuanced, objective, balanced. Objective I don't like, because I grew up with this in the Soviet Union. So let's say a more balanced, more multifaceted sort of story.
Including your own memories. I like this idea of you have to wrestle with the young Zubok when you're writing this book.
Right.
You mentioned just now, and you mentioned earlier about the kind of unwritten rule for historians, that enough time has passed that we can now perhaps evaluate events in a little more balanced fashion, not objective, as you said.
Well,
so what?
You wish.
Yeah.
You wish.
So what have we gotten wrong for the last 30 years that we need to reevaluate? And maybe here I'm thinking too of Jack Matlock, who was also a former speaker here, the former ambassador who was there at the time too, has argued that even at that time and ever since, we tend to mix up 3 historical events that are related but not the same thing: the end of the Cold War, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So what needs to be revised the most? What do we need to rethink the most now that we're at the 30-year mark?
Well, I like this formula of Jack Matlock, whom I respect enormously, and his book, An Autopsy on an Empire, is a huge, excellent effort to write this balanced, considering when he did it in 1992, that was exhilaration, disillusionment, emotions were galore on all kinds of, on both poles, if you like, for or against. He did a remarkable job. So rereading this book, that served as my sort of, I stood on his shoulders, let's put it this way. In terms of the formula that we should treat the end of the Cold War, collapse of communism, and the collapse of USSR as three different strands, I agree, because in my own work, on the early stages, I was writing this book for years. At the early stages, when I tried to share my preliminary conclusions with someone who, let's say, was convinced that, for instance, the Poles won the Cold War, by destroying communism, I met with total rejection of the whole idea. Why to write such a book? Because we already done it. We, the Poles, we Eastern Europeans, we destroyed communism, and after that, the falling dominoes were only a matter of months and a couple of years, and so the evil empire was gone. So, as I said earlier, the Soviet Union was remarkably resilient. There was nothing like falling dominoes. At every stage, I found that it took specific efforts and initiatives by Gorbachev, together by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, or Republican leaders, and of course the coup makers, to drive one nail after another into the Soviet coffin. And the Soviet Union was still alive in September, in October, in November. So the last chapter, I was thinking of good titles for my chapters. So the one-word title for each chapter, 15 one-word titles. That was my sort of little achievement. The title for the last chapter was Liquidation. And if you compare it with what Yeltsin, Gaidar, and others write about the Soviet Union, it was already gone. And if you look at the formula used by the leaders of three republics, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus, on December 8th, in their famous declaration of the Commonwealth, мы констатируем, что Советский Союз не существует. We sort of, we affirm or we accept that the Soviet Union exists no more as an object of geopolitical reality and international law. So they sort of, the declaration says it all. We didn't destroy the Soviet Union. It's already a corpse. We came to Belovezha to pass a verdict, an autopsy. This is the title for Matlock's book, right? In fact, it's not true. So it took enormous efforts to destroy the Soviet Union. You may consider, depending on your views, if you think the Soviet Union should have been killed like Count Dracula by driving all his stakes into its heart, it took a lot of stakes. So, that's kind of, contradicts the conclusions of those guys who counted on falling dominoes. And those who, of course, if we look at historiography, what we find, we go to the shelf about the end of the Soviet era. What do we find? We find a few books about the Soviet collapse that were written, before. They're rather thin. Lots of books on foreign policy and the end of the Cold War, and still growing number of those books. So in my own book, considering what already was done by others, I wrote very little on foreign policy, on Reagan, on 1989, on the miracle of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, on the fall of the Berlin Wall. I did write about it, but primarily with the view of how it affected domestic politics in the Soviet Union. And my total focus, and it was difficult because the pull of the end of the Cold War story is such a great story. It was an enormous pull, but I resisted it.
As much as I would like to ask more questions, we've gone over the half-hour mark of the conversation between the two of us. So it seems like a good time to perhaps open the floor to questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
So for those in the audience who would like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or just put something in chat, either a cue or you want to ask a question, or indicate to me that you would like to ask a question. We do have one in the chat, so I'll start with that.
If you can turn on for a moment your video, it's nice to see your faces and your facial expressions.
Yes, I agree.
Or disapproval.
So let me ask the one question that's in the chat already from a colleague from Copenhagen, an associate professor of geography, specializing on studying the impact of the collapse in the Soviet Union on land use. So he wants to know if you covered the implications of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the environment.
No, that I left for other scholars to do. I don't think it was very high on. Well, we all know about the movements, post Chernobyl in particular, so-called eco nationalism movements. Yet I know that other people did the good work on those movements. My focus was elsewhere on Gorbachev's policies. I think the fact that perestroika failed clearly in 1989 allowed those eco movements, and because Gorbachev empowered the republics and local structures by creating that, by giving them ready-made system of representation, encouraging glasnost, making those voices heard all over the country through the use of television. It was ideal environment for eco movements to turn political. And eco nationalism began to prevail over ecological element of it. So I do write about Ukraine. I realized that guys like Yuri Sherbak and others came from eco movements. Plenty of intellectuals came from there, but they took a very hard nationalist line in 1991. And that is more interesting for my story, because in the focus of my story is the destruction of the Soviet state.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? If you can indicate with the raised hand function or in the chat, that would be great. We do have one in the chat as well from Jess from Berlin. To what extent did the collapse of other Eastern Bloc governments impact the Soviet Union's collapse? Getting to your last point there, Vlad, that while you don't focus on them, you at least study the impact of them in the Soviet Union. So expand on that.
Well, I sort of rest on the conclusions of Mark Kramer from Harvard, who published a lot on this, the so-called spillover effect. I again, back to my memories, I remember I met the new year of 1989 in the company of a Polish professor, a Polish historian. And I was personally so excited by what happened, the fall of the wall, the domino, that was real domino effects in Eastern Europe, that I told him, wait, in just 1 year, we will not see the red flag over the Kremlin. I remember even raising a toast with champagne to that. I was wrong by 1 year. But also, it was more of a lyrical mood, emotion than analysis. The Polish guy looked at me very skeptically. He didn't believe what I told him at the time, which, by the way, is interesting, because later on many Poles said, of course, of course. It's very hard to measure. It's very hard to measure this impact. That's the problem. Kramer is right. The spillover effect on the Baltics was great. On Western Ukraine was enormous. On Moldova was enormous. Perhaps on Georgia, again, you have to go into details and measure this effect. But what about the Russian Federation? Because the separatism of Russian Federation is in the center of my story of the Soviet collapse, not the Balts. Not even Ukraine, not Georgia, not Nagorno-Karabakh. I know very well how important it was, but Russian separatism. And was it affected by what happened in the fall of 1989? Hard to say. Take for instance, take a look at how the Russian Declaration of Sovereignty was voted by huge majority of newly elected deputies to the Congress of People's Deputies of RSFSR. You know how many KGB officers vote for it? How many military officers voted for it? Those guys had just seen what happened in Eastern Europe. Did they suddenly go crazy? They resented the hasty retreat from Eastern Europe, and yet they voted for the Declaration of Sovereignty of the Russian Federation. I don't think it was, what happened in Eastern Europe directly related to the change of their position. I think they resented Gorbachev's leadership. I think they accepted that Gorbachev's reforms failed. And they wanted to separate the Russian Federation from under Gorbachev rule. And I'm not original in this conclusion. There are plenty of reminiscences about it, and other authors write about it, mostly Russian authors. So it's much more the origins of the Russian separatism are much more complex than just a spillover effect, than the domino effect. And I did argue in my book, well, you will be the judge whether I was convincing, that without this Russian separatism, everything else would not have destroyed the Soviet state. The Balts, yeah, we can argue forever whether Gorbachev should have let the Balts go. And as his assistant Chernyaev said, that was a gangrenous process, the gangrene that came from the Balts into Russia. We can argue, but by themselves, the Balts understood very well they would never have succeeded independence without the alliance with Russian democracy and Russian separatism. The same even goes for Ukraine. That here I should probably stop. I write a lot about Ukraine in my last chapters of the book, so I would, leave it for the readers when they get the book to see.
Well, you cut off my question. If there's any other questions, please do raise your hand, or here we go. I was going to ask more about Ukraine because I was thinking of Serhiy Plokhy's book, The Last Empire, where he focuses on Ukraine.
I can comment on Sergei. He's a good friend of mine, yes.
Let's first, we have another question here in chat, and that is, how do you see the effects of the Baltic nations rejecting the USSR, especially the chain, the Baltic Way, the song festivals?
Yes.
Were they as gangrenous in retrospect as they seem to be at the time?
Chernyaev wrote about it, and that means that many people, even in Gorbachev's entourage, believed it was hugely consequential. At the same time, the story of the Baltic march to independence is kind of a typical story. It's the story of separatists, or those who pretended they're not separatists, they just want more autonomy, economic, political autonomy. That's the story of those people receiving complete green light from the center. And Gorbachev said, yes, I will devolve power to you. So the wake-up call was, of course, the Baltic chain, after which Gorbachev turned around a little bit, published a very hard, he edited it himself. The Balts could not believe it. Well, he was the author of a very harsh manifesto in August 1989. It was Gorbachev himself. And then Gorbachev was lost. He searched for clue in Leninist legacy on nationalism. He couldn't find, any. And he didn't know what to do with the Balts. He didn't know in a similar way what to do with the Russians. He kind of refused to put 2 and 2 together, that the Baltic nationalism was feeding Russian nationalism. And later on, the same happened to Ukraine. He refused to accept very simple formula that the more Yeltsin demanded separate existence, autonomy for the Russian Federation, the more Ukraine had to claim the same, something that is quite clear today in retrospect. And again, Sergei Plokhy writes about it very, very well, if only exaggerating grossly the role of the Ukrainian factor.
Other questions for Vlad Zubak while we have a couple minutes here? you've given the answer to my question on Flohi's book. So one here, you mentioned that the roots of Gorbachev's personality can be found easily in the near past, as even in the 1960s. Can you elaborate on this? You mentioned the Kosygin reforms, I think. What kind of evidence should we have been paying attention to, in other words?
Yes. So we back to Gorbachev, which is fair. This is why I didn't even try to decenter Gorbachev from my account. After all, he inherited a huge power. The general secretary, well, for instance, people sometimes say, under Brezhnev, the character of power in the Soviet Union changed. It was no longer Stalin-like. That's true, and yet Brezhnev single-handedly pushed the Soviet Union to détente, at least important elements of détente, such as accepting Ostpolitik or European Conference. Without Brezhnev, it would not have happened. The Soviet Union would not have accepted Basket 3 on human rights or Helsinki Final Act without Brezhnev. So the importance of one personality of the general secretary in directing domestic and foreign policies of the country remained enormous. Why did Gorbachev decide to practically impose on the country not ready for those experiments, to impose such thing as socialist democracy? Because it was the dream of his cohort of people of the 60s. And if you check my book, Zhivago's Children, I write at length about that. And people who had gone through the war, through World War II. Gorbachev was a kid, but he remembered that. The post-war period, disillusionment, late Stalinism, the new hope for the future under Khrushchev, they kind of focused on democracy as something that should be added to socialism. Khrushchev called it different names: decentralization, Sovnarkhozy, you name it. So the entire era of post-Stalin reformist search revolved around the idea, what can be done with this monolith of the Stalinist state? Natural answers: decentralize it, democratize it. But people who began to look into it didn't realize how dangerous it was, and they didn't know exactly how to pursue it. Moreover, Gorbachev was not a democratizer in sort of liberal democratic way of the West. He tried to build something that had never existed in history, that even didn't exist under Lenin, maybe only in the form of some kind of anarchist communes in 1917, 1918. He was building socialist democracy. So that was linked, I guess, to mythology, special cultural world of his cohort of educated people. In this case, his years at the Moscow State University, I think, proved to be decisive. He was part of that mythological universe, if you like. That explains his link as the Soviet leader who went through all the stages of party bureaucracy to the so-called intelligentsia, in this case, party intelligentsia that worked inside the party, but still was connected to people of culture, people of arts, political thinkers, and believed that the country reached Chernayev is a great example of it. He was very close to Gorbachev in some way, different from Gorbachev in many other ways. But they were close in the belief that the Stalinist model reached its impasse and needed to be revived by what? Socialist democracy. And both Chernayev and Gorbachev in 86, 87, 88 basically acted as ideologists, imperiling Soviet power, undercutting Soviet power. Compare them to somebody like Deng Xiaoping, who had his rough moments during the Great Leap Forward and other But as soon as Deng Xiaoping came to power, he was completely aware that the power is in the party. The power is in the military. So control over the party, control over the army, and so on and so forth is the key for future reforms. You can turn this huge mechanisms to implement reforms, something that Gorbachev started to do in 86, 87, but quickly got disillusioned and declared that the bureaucracy is actually the biggest obstacle to reforms. Ended up without any tools at all, just the skeptical army and very dubious KGB who turned against him ultimately.
You just mentioned Deng Xiaoping, and my colleague Shell Anderson here at Miami has posted in the chat to asking you to question or to discuss the lesson of 1991 and how it's affected the policies of the Chinese Communist Party today. Is that still the policy that what you describe with Deng?
Yeah. I always say to my Russian colleagues, we had this wonderful discussion, why Russian historians and social scientists refuse to face the lessons of 1991. So little was published, no discussions, no roundtables. It's an ostrich kind of approach to the past. They may go all the way back to Ivan the Terrible, right? And Peter the Great, but they don't want to dig into the lessons of 1991, where, the many mistakes were made, tactical, strategic, otherwise. And it's crucial for Russia, whatever Russia will emerge, to understand those mistakes. Compare it now to China. Or sounds one, I don't read Chinese, unfortunately, but some experts published that a number of institutes attached to the party studied in depth the lessons of the Soviet collapse. And you may say they adhere to the line of Deng Xiaoping by arguing that it's important to lose control over the party, over the apparatus, and so on and so forth. But at least they tried. At least they sort of try to learn from the Soviet mistakes. So the contrast cannot be more striking between the way the Chinese learned from 1991 in the right way, in the wrong way. It's another matter, but it definitely affected their approach to in the subsequent three decades. And the way the Soviet, post-Soviet Russia failed to learn from these lessons. With some exceptions. I do think that Putin, for instance, learned important lessons from 1991, but sort of kept those lessons to himself. It's sort of like a secret knowledge of how to keep power, maintain power, not to lose power, that derive much from, people say, previous Stalinist era, but I think also from the period of the collapse. 88, 91.
So you've brought us to the present, sort of, with Putin. And I want to ask one last question, and that is to go back to the beginning and to remind our audience about your own background at the Institute for the U.S. and Canada in Moscow, combined with your expertise in the history of international relations. You're a keen observer of international affairs. When added to the Having-Hearst Center's mission to better relations between the United States and the USSR, we are at a moment when relations aren't very good, to make an understatement here. So what, if anything, could change? How could relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, Russia, get better? What would be the grounds for improving relations?
Well, I'm not in a position to replace the entire Kremlinology. If whatever exists now is the Kremlinology in this glorious country of the United States of America and the Western world. When the collapse happened, this industry was much more powerful, as we all remember back then. Many more centers who studied what happens in Moscow. Nowadays, it's generational change. It's all this. Let me say a few things tentatively. What should be done? When I see all this demonization of the Russian leadership, which I don't like myself. This kind of, Russians did this, Russians did that. I see it as a clear manifestation of deterioration of the climate where expertly conclusions are possible. In fact, it's enough to compare how the Bush administration analyzed, Bush CIA, Bush, State Department analyzed, the last year of the Soviet Union in 1991 with what is done today. It's day and night. I mean, I'm not privy to classified information today, but sort of everything is splurged out, on the pages of the New York Times and other, sources. So you cannot, you don't need the skills of, Goodwin and magician to guess. I'm of very high opinion of how the analysis worked in 1991. I take my hat off to the analysts. I take my hat off to people like Scowcroft, and even to an extent Bush. Bush, I think, and Scowcroft and Baker and a couple of other people formed a fantastic team and that looked at what happened in the Soviet Union, highly confusing events in the Soviet Union, through remarkably nuanced and fine-grained, kind of lenses. Today, it's not true. So I wish some of it could be retained. Russophobia, I think, is an old American disease. Let me be blunt about it. It comes and goes, but now it just obstructs, blocks the light, I would say. Yes, I would recommend to look into interaction between foreign policy and the study of domestic elites and domestic priorities. Nowadays, people do separate things. They either focus on foreign policy or on elites or on domestic politics. Now, very few people who can do all of that. With all respect for recent methodological turns, I would prefer all of us to stick with the evidence instead of finding our way among this interpretation, that interpretation. So just one thing to say, Russian archives are wide open. How many people go there? How many people know they're open? How many people try to get, information from these archives? So I guess, nothing that I can say will save the world, but one thing that I found in my research on the Soviet collapse, it was sudden, it was unforeseen. Again, people who in 1988 thought that collapse was unthinkable and inconceivable, just in 2 years said it was overdetermined. Is it possible today? I'm not going into structural vulnerabilities of today's regime, today's Russia and all that. I think it's a very vastly different situation. I don't think such a sudden collapse is possible. However, sudden change is possible. In fact, change is always sudden in a sense. I remember I had an interview back in 2012 with, that guy who predicted the end of history, Frank Fukuyama. And I asked him, and he worked in the State Department at the time in the Bush administration. So, Frank, did you expect the collapse of the Soviet Union? He said, of course not. I said, why? I lived in the Soviet Union. We sort of already were out in the streets. Everything was changing. Soviet power was an erosion. But he said, listen, bureaucracies are never good at analyzing change. They're good about extrapolating policies. That's what they're about. The same probably should be said about scholars and epistemological communities. They're very good at continuing their ad infinitum, their special debates about this and that. But change, no, change, it always comes as a big jolt, as a big surprise. I
Well,
see another
Vlad,
question about the Baltics. And as I live in Estonia, tensions. Well, it's an interesting topic. Current occupation of Ukraine, Afghanistan. With sorting it all, parsing it all out. Let me say that I think one of my conclusions in the book is that the change happened too suddenly. The collapse came too suddenly. So plenty of questions that could have been, maybe should have been discussed, negotiated, and sorted out between the Russian Federation and Estonia, between the Russian Federation and Georgia, Ukraine, the issue of Crimea. They were not discussed. And I was interested in particular why they were not discussed, not just point blank, as most of people say, oh, they went under the cover. No, why? What was the specific reason why those issues were not discussed? When you, for instance, take the moment when Yeltsin signed a decree on unconditional acceptance of the Baltic independence, that was August 24th, 1991, where he came to meet the Estonian and Latvian delegations right after that glorious ceremony of burial of the three martyrs, the people killed in the August days, 3 young men killed. And after the huge Russian flag, I think it was 200 meters long, flag was carried by a huge crowd across the Red Square. So he signed it off, basically using the legal formulas, the text prepared by Estonian lawyers. Without even having Russian lawyers behind his back. Have you encountered many cases in history when one state grants independence to another state? It was legally violation of everything because Russia was still not sovereign itself, but soon would become sovereign. But Yeltsin did it even without looking into the text, just signed it off. Problems. Which problems? We'll sort them. So now they continue to sort them out, as you see. That's tension. On Crimea, it's even, of course, more deeply rooted. I wouldn't go into it, but I dedicated quite a few pages of the origins of the Crimea problem in 1991, in the fall of 1991. So when you read the book, I think you will find more in it than Plokhy wrote about in his book and other Western authors. There's some interesting findings I found by reading the local Crimean press, by talking to some people in Crimea. So it's everything is in the details in history.
well, we are at time, and I could think of no better teaser to remind us to read the book that Vlad will publish here. And I think November is when it comes out. We're all looking forward to reading Collapse. In the meantime, thank you, Vlad, so much for joining us today. You've given us all something to think about while we wait for the book to land in our hands. And great to see you, and thanks others for joining us.
It's big and heavy, but I think it reads well, particularly after cutting it down by 1/3 and after my editors pushed me hard to make it readable. You know how difficult it is. But thank you, Steve, for inviting me. It's a pity I cannot be in Ohio. I remember Karin Davisha, as if we parted yesterday. It is a lot of nostalgia. Okay, thank you for having me.